All right, well, we're going to get started. So I want to welcome everybody to tonight's parenting education. It's regarding educational advocacy for your children in the public school system. I'm absolutely thrilled that you're here. My name is Renee Hettich. I am the program director of the Agape program in the Southern Tier and Central New York regions of New York State. I am also a parent of 4 children, 3 of which have special education needs, 2 of which have Section 504 plans, and 1 who has special education services and an individual educational plan. And I've been working with school districts for almost 30 years, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk about how to effectively work with your school district to ensure that your child gets the services they need to be successful. I'm thrilled to be here with Caryl. I'm going to allow Caryl to introduce herself.
Thank you, Renee. Hi, everybody. I'm Caryl Deiches, and I'm a family support specialist with our Long Island office with our Agape program. And I wear a lot of different hats. I work in mental health. I work on a lot of SPOA programs. I was a SEPTA president and very active in my school district when my kids were in school. I'm happy to announce a happy, healthy, both a product of the public education system, special education system, and they are my proudest accomplishment. So of all the titles I wear, the title of mom, I am most proud. They both came home to me through adoption. And I'm really excited to be here to share some of the tips and strategies that I've used over the years for their success. Thank you, Renee.
Thanks, Caryl. Glad you're with me tonight. So before we get started, if you do have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. If we have time at the end, we will review those questions with you, but we do ask that we do that at the end to ensure the confidentiality of you and your family. Because at the end of this workshop, we will stop recording so that we can answer your personal questions. With that said, here's where we're headed tonight. We're really going to talk about, does your child need that special support in a school system? If so, what does that look like? And then if so, how do you work collaboratively with your child's school to access the support and the services that your child needs to be successful? So that's where we're headed for the rest of this evening. And we just want to really, over and over, you're going to hear Caryl and I talk about that. Every child has a right to a free and appropriate public education based on their individual needs. That is federal law, that every child has the right. And that's what we're going to focus on this evening. So I'm going to pass it along to Caryl so she can talk a little bit about, does your child need support? And if so, what does that look like? So Caryl?
Thank you, Renee. This is always a difficult thing to ascertain, right? Like, does my child need support? Are they doing something that's typical? You know, what's not typical? So sometimes that's a hard thing to ascertain. But the easiest thing to think about is your child struggling, and are they coming home frustrated? Are they having a hard time paying attention in class? Are you seeing things affected with their grades? Are they failing classes? Are they angry? Are they having behavioral issues at home? Do they have a hard time being in class and getting the information in regards to, can they do the math? Can they read? Can they write? Are they able to be successful in the classroom? If any of these things ring true, and I'm sure 1 or 2 of these bells may be going off in your head, then yes, your child may need some educational supports. And they may not be the same for everyone. So just because one child has one issue doesn't mean that your child has the same issue. And you may have 2 children that have reading issues, and the intervention will be different. And I want to go to the next slide because I want to talk about what intervention is, right? So what are you available to get in regards to educational supports? Well, very simply, sometimes it's just a very simple classroom adjustment. It could be a sensory issue in the class. Sometimes our kids are real fidgeters, and particularly when they're young, and sometimes when they're old, they need supports. It could be something as simple as we call them a little cushion that the kids sit on in class, but it helps regulate them and helps them focus because they may have a sensory issue. My daughter used to have sensory manipulable things on her table. So it literally was a little piece of sandpaper on her table. So when she was distracted, she'd rub her finger on the sandpaper and it would help refocus her and bring her back to where she was, as opposed to keep her wandering around the classroom. There are a lot of trauma responsible educational practices that I know Renee is going to get a little bit more into detail later, but this is a whole nother area that is really important and can be addressed at school by bringing attention to your district that there are challenges with your child and adjustment, and making sure that the teachers and the treatment team working with your child is aware of those challenges so that they could be using appropriate language and strategies for their success. And this, again, goes back to adoption sensitive subjects. Many times, if people aren't aware and your educators aren't aware, there are a lot of projects that may trigger your child. They may be asking them to do a childhood tree project, or even like, what is your blood type? What color hair did your parents have? Maybe they don't know what their biological parents' hair color was. So, we want to make sure that we provide information and strategies and alternatives to the people that educate our children so that they know how to get the best out of them, and also have it be a more inclusive relationship with the school, because all of our kids need to be included, but sometimes in different ways so they're not triggered by painful memories. And that's primarily the definition of response to intervention. And again, Renee will get into that in a little bit more detail. One of the other educational supports that you can seek out is a 504 accommodation, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about that. But that's primarily accommodations that address an individual that may have health or other concerns that are related to, but not specifically a educational deficit, right? And then, of course, special education services via an individual education plan, what we call an IEP, that will address and help support a student that learns differently. So I always say this, that you are the expert. You are the person that knows your child the best, and you know what they need to be successful. Whenever I go into a meeting with anybody at the school and everybody introduces themselves, I'm often sometimes, especially if I'm by myself, I'll be sitting there, they're like, well, I'm Dr. This, I'm Dr. That. And I'm like, well, I'm mom. But now I go in with, I'm mom, CEO of the Deiches household. I am director of operations of our home environment. And, because I have just as information and probably a lot more information than the people sitting around the table with me, because I know my child best. And we have an innate sense of what they need because we're with them all the time. So don't forget to use your power and never feel intimidated by people in a room. You're an equal in every meeting that you have. Renee? You're muted.
So before we talk about actual services and how to access specific services, we really wanted to talk a little bit about how do you work in a positive way with your school district? Because I think for many of us, whether we're intimidated by their expertise, as Caryl was just talking, even though we are the expert in the room, along with our student, our child is the expert in their own well-being. But quite often, we get frustrated, we get angry, we get concerned, we block, right? Because it's so difficult sometimes to work well with the school districts. So first we want to talk about how can we work well? How can we build a relationship with our school district? So the first thing is always go in with a goal in mind. Whether the goal is adoption sensitive curriculum, whether the goal is obtaining a Section 504 accommodation, or whether it's getting special education services through the IEP process. Always know what your purpose is, why you're there, what your goal is, what do you want the outcome to be? So before you step in the room, know already, this is what I want as a result, and be purposeful in getting there, right? So that you can find meaningful growth in school success through appropriate services. And it seems simple, but I can say to you, the majority of families that I help prepare for a meeting, when I ask them this question, they struggle. Right? And if you don't know what your end result is that you want, you can't move toward it. So please before you go into any meeting, say, okay, what is the goal of this meeting for my child, so that you can move forward there that way. The other thing I would say is really be open and engaged. I think a lot of us get into these meetings where we're sitting around the table with 10 other people and we shut down, right? It's stressful, it's difficult. So we close ourselves off instead of being open and engaged with the meeting. So again, as Caryl said, you are the absolute expert on your child. Be confident, go into that meeting, know that, and go into that meeting without any fear. Hold on one moment. I've got my son walking by. Just a second. He's returning from the gym. The other thing to ensure that you're open and engaged, right, is truly listen to the other individuals in the room. The teacher, your child, most importantly, if your child is at that meeting, the administrators, the support staff. Right? The classroom aide, the classroom teaching assistant typically knows your child better than the teacher, for example. But be open and listen and speak for mutual understanding. Quite often, for those of you who know me well, you'll hear me quite often say things like, I hear you saying, and I'll repeat back what I've heard, right? It's called reflective listening. I believe I understand you to say, right? I'm going to summarize what I think I understand. All of those little tag conversations that start a conversation is something that will help you stay open and engaged. For those of you who've gone through our Reframing Parenting course, you will know about PACE, right? Be playful, right? These meetings can be very serious, right? You need to lighten the load for yourself, and to be honest with you, the professionals in the room also feel weight. And if you're playful and engaging and trying to make this conversation pleasant and fun, you're going to go much farther than if everybody is just bogged down by the seriousness of what's happening. So be playful, right? Be accepting of their point of view so that they can accept your point of view. Be curious, right? Ask those open-ended questions. Really be curious about what they're proposing and what's happening with your child, right? So that you can then feed that back to them. And although sometimes it can be really hard when there is a hard meeting with an administrator or a teacher, to have empathy for them too, right? They're wanting the same as you, want the best for your child, but at times it's hard for them as well. And they're experiencing the stress. And we need to show that we understand and we're empathetic toward them. And when we do that, they will be reciprocal to us. So really do pace yourself in these meetings. The other thing that's so important is you have to come prepared. Again, whether it's to talk about how to incorporate sensory activities into the classroom, or whether it's advocating for a special placement through an IEP, you have to be prepared. You have to be able to communicate what your child's needs are, what your child's strengths are too, right? Because we want to build on our children's strengths, right? Because that's the other thing that I see quite often in these meetings. All the professionals come and quite often parents will come and just list all of the challenges that child has, right? All of the struggles, all of the difficulties. And when you turn it around and say, what does my child do well? Where does my child excel? And then you can build on that, and that changes the entire tenure of a meeting. Right? So be clear about what your needs are. Bring documentation, bring the research, bring the reports. If you've done outside evaluations, which Carol's going to talk about later, bring it with you. If you have proof of progress over progress notes, teacher, bring those, right? Be very data driven. So come prepared. Other things that I find quite often parents are reluctant to ask questions because again, I think some of us feel that we're not the experts or we should know the answer, or we don't want to look, ridiculous in front of these experts, like, oh, why don't you know that, right? You should know that. But I can say to you, be curious, ask as many questions as you want. That's why those professionals are there to help you answer those questions. Be curious. I often will say, and my staff hear this all the time, I'm curious about, and then I'll ask that open-ended question. An open-ended question is a question that you can't answer with yes, no, good, bad. You have to say something, right? So I'm curious about what to help me understand the impact of physical therapy on my child's performance in the classroom. They can't say yes, they can't say no, they have to tell me something, right? And it shows that I'm curious, that I'm wanting to understand, and it requires them to give me an answer. And what's really interesting as you do that, you know your end goal, and quite often when you use those open-ended questions and you're curious, we can quite often get a school district from a no to a yes. So for example, my school district was going to decline my child, who's a multiply impaired child, decline him occupational therapy services. But when I started being curious and I started asking the question, and I talked directly to the OT, and I said, well, help me understand, just like I said, how did the occupational therapy service change my child's performance in the classroom? And when she was able to answer that question and prove to the team that OT services increased his focus for so many more additional minutes, increased his ability to complete his reading tasks, right? Because I was able to do that, and she was able to prove to the committee that yes, this is having an impact on my child's services or on my child's success, they did not decline him OT services, and actually they added additional OT services. So be curious, want to know, and quite often when you do that, it does get you to your goal. The other thing that I think is important, some of us go into these meetings adversarial. I want A, B, and C, and I'm going to get it no matter what. And I know you're not going to give it to me, right? And we're just, before we even open the door, we're at odds with each other. Right? I would ask that you do the opposite, right? We're going to come into that room. We're going to work together as a team to ensure your child or my students' success. Right? Because, for example, to use that OT example again, I knew before I went in the door they were going to decline him services. So I could have gone in there adversarial and said, you have to give me OT services. And I wouldn't have gotten them. But instead, I was curious if we open-ended questions. I allowed the OT to give the proof that I knew she had so that we could continue, right? And we found that common ground. Right? And negotiate, right? Change that no to a yes through negotiations, right? And ask, what if, right? What if my child has occupational therapy services? What will that mean? Or what if my child doesn't? And what does that mean, right? If my child doesn't receive physical therapy services in the school, what's that impact going to be on my child's educational program, right? So just looking at reports and getting a recommendation is not where you want to head. You want to head into how will these services, existing or not existing, impact on my child's success, right? And I often say to my team, for my own kids, can we consider whatever it is, right? And almost always the school district takes a pause and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, we can do that, right? I have a child with a Section 504 plan, and he and I went in together because he's now going to be a senior in high school. And we went in together and we said, would you consider me, he asked, can you consider me using text Or speech to text when I write more than a paragraph. And the school looked at him like, oh my gosh, yes, we can do that, right? So it's about negotiating, collaborating, being curious, right? Rather than being adversarial or being the parent who sits and just accepts whatever they decide, right? Because that's also not where you want to be. You want to be in a space where you're working and you come to a joint decision, right? Not the school telling you what they're going to do. It's what you and the school decide together that's in the best interest of your child, right? Very different dynamic. Before I pass it to Caryl, let me just give you a couple of do's and don'ts. Some of the things that I see happen all the time, and I'll be honest, I got caught in this once myself, and that is blaming and shaming the school. Because quite often, I don't know about your experience, but for my experience, quite often I'll enter these meetings for my children and immediately the school and the teacher will blame and shame my child, right? Which we know is not okay. But then I retaliate by blaming and shaming the school. So I need to always step back and stop myself from doing that. And, stopping them from blaming and shaming my child, right? Making a demand, again, will create that adversarial experience and will get you nowhere, right? If I went in and demanded, I want OT services 3 times a week, I would have gotten a no, right? So you're not in there to make a demand. You're in there to collaborate to get to the goal that you set for yourself before you walked in the door. Confronting and threatening is not a productive strategy. We've had many families who have brought in attorneys, for example, and just that confrontation and that threat. What I've seen, although in the short term, they may have gotten the placement that they wanted for their child over the course of the educational experience, because it now is a confrontational experience, everything turned into a fight. And the relationship broke down between the school, the parent, the child, and the teacher. So it was not a productive experience. So that's always your last resort, and Carol's going to talk about that. The other thing is so hard is don't take it personally, right? Sometimes you'll go into these meetings and again, they so focus on the negative aspects of your child. Their school districts are very diagnostic and deficit based, where we as parents and social workers are the opposite. We're strength based and skill based. So, as they're describing your child, I can remember sitting there for an hour listening to every single evaluation and how poorly my child did, right? And then you're just so deflated. So you have to step away from that, which is hard. Now, some things to do, right? Instead of blame, shame, demands, etc. First is to use I statements, right? So there's a big difference between me going into the school district and saying, you need to provide occupational therapy for my child. Or versus, I believe that my child's educational success will improve with occupational therapy services. Very different approach, which gets a very different result, right? So use I statements. I believe, my child believes, and if your child is in the room, they can speak for themselves. Be respectful, be emotionally regulated. So this is always interesting because this is a very emotional experience for every parent. It's terrifying to walk into a room of, I've had at times up to 20 professionals because my child is very complex. It's terrifying, right? It's very escalating for us as parents, right? But you really do need to stay in your grounded self, regulated. And it's interesting, quite often I will attend a CSC meeting with a parent. And most of the time, my only job is to ensure their emotional regulation as a co-regulator, right? So I may sit next to them and I'll take some deep breaths, I'll relax my body, and so will they, for example. I have one family who actually says to me right off the bat, he said, I don't want you to do anything in this meeting, but make sure I stay calm. Right? So be regulated. If you can't do that on your own, take somebody with you who can help you do that. Be organized. Carol's going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to leave that to her. But it is incredibly overwhelming, the amount of paper, whether it's virtual or digital or actual paper, that comes out of this process. And the other key is talk to the people who can help. You've got to know who the people with the power are, right? Who can make this change for you and build a relationship with them, right? For example, I have a very great working relationship with my child's teachers, therapist, and the CSE chairperson and I know each other very well and consider each other's friends at this point, right? Because we have spent years building a relationship. And I know if I need something for my child, I can pick up the phone, call my CSE chairperson, and within minutes, my child's needs are being met. So it's really about who do you build those relationships with? Those are some of the tips and tricks of how to work collaboratively. I'm going to take, sorry, that's my puppy dog barking. I'm going to take just a couple more minutes and then I'm going to pass it to Caryl for her expertise in special ed. But before we get to special ed, right, how do we access those other items like classroom adjustments? For example, like Caryl said earlier, having sensory opportunities for our kids in the classroom, whether it's the sandpaper that she talked about, fidgets, the rubber band on the chair that you can bounce your feet on, right? Are there sensory adjustments that need to be made? Are there other adjustments that need to be made? So for example, I have a child with a visual processing disorder, and I walked into one of his third grade classrooms and the visual stimuli were absolutely overwhelming, right? So we needed to prune that, right? Filter that out so that he could be successful. That's another example of a classroom adjustment. Right? Trauma responsiveness, right? Knowing how to regulate your child, knowing how to de-escalate your child, knowing how to ensure that your child feels safe in the classroom are all important things that your teacher needs to know. And you as the parent and the child will work with that teacher to do. As well as, you know, Caryl, I talked about adoption sensitive alternatives, right? We've all had our kids bring home the family tree, right? How do we help a teacher look at it in a new way? We've all had Mother's Days and Father's Days celebrated. How do we help the teacher look at them in new ways? So the things that happen in the classroom are really an opportunity for you as the parent, and if the child is old enough, the child, to engage the classroom teacher and the administrator in these discussions, right? Give them the tools that they need to meet your child's needs, right? And I just want to go back actually to something Caryl said. The trauma responsive practices also include triggers. If your child has triggers that you're aware of, the teacher needs to know them, right? So that the teacher can accommodate that child, right? If your child, for example, is triggered by a particular smell, right? The teacher needs to know, hey, don't bring tacos into the room, or whatever the smell is, right? So these are incredibly important. And what I encourage families to do is take that first couple of weeks of school, meet with that teacher, and if you need be, that administrator, to talk about these things, because the teacher wants your child to be successful. But if the teacher doesn't have the tools or the knowledge, she won't be able, or he won't be able to do that. And then I'll be honest, what do we do as parents? We get upset with them. Well, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? And then the teachers are like, well, I didn't know, right? So it's our role to give them the tools that they need, right? set that meeting that first couple of weeks of school and just have a one-on-one conversation to get, and this will be ongoing, right? The first couple of weeks of school, everybody's overwhelmed. But another technique that some of our parents are doing is they're putting together like a little one-pager about their child, a little bit about their history, a little bit about their incredible strengths and interests, some of the challenges that they have, and their triggers. And they provide that and as a written document to the teacher, who can file it in a confidential place and be able to continually refer back to it. Oh, wait, this child is triggered by the fire alarm, for example. Or this child really does well when he's in a leadership role. So I'm going to make him line leader this week, right? So, and if you haven't done that in the past, please reach out to your family support specialist and they can help you design one specifically for your child. But it's a great way to get the conversation started, give them something that gives them strategies that they can pull out at any time. And it, sets the groundwork that your child needs to have success in the classroom setting. So that's at the classroom level, right? The next level of service, and then I'm going to turn it to Caryl, is called RTI, Responsive to Intervention Services. I know it's an awful name, but everybody knows it as RTI. RTI services are services for children who are performing below expectations, and they're typically small group and sometimes one-on-one additional support, particularly in math and reading. So if you have a child who's reading below grade level and you want them to have smaller group or individual intervention without going into the special ed process, which Carol's going to talk about in a second, you can request RTI services through your classroom teacher and your principal. Right? It's a very simple request. You literally send them an email and then they will determine if your child is eligible and then talk to you about the receipt of services. This is the first place you stop before you head off into special education services, which is what we're going to talk about next. So Caryl, I am going to turn it to you to talk about special education.
Thank you, Renee. And I love everything you just said. In fact, my favorite tip that you provided was the Dear Teacher letter that you send at the beginning of the year. And I still have all of mine. And I have to say, my son, who is now 18 years old, graduated. He's in the military. He's actually applying for a higher level training in the military. And he called me, he's like, Mom, you know that letter that we used to do all the time, but with all the things I do good, and can you send me that letter? I'm going to use it for my application. And sure enough, it had like all his strengths, all the things that he does, his volunteer work, the things that make him unique and special. And those are things to hold on to. And it's a great tip. I love that one, Renee. And it brings me to this topic here. It's like, who needs special ed services? Well, it could be any one of our kids, right? The truth about special ed is that all of our kids think and learn differently. And I'm sure if I asked all of you here today, how do you learn? Some of you learn better by seeing the information. Some of you learn better by hearing it. Some of you need to hear and see information. I'm definitely an auditory learner. I have actually visual issues myself. I'm an adult dyslexic. So when I see written words, it's very difficult for me to learn that way. But when I hear things, I'm spot on, right? So it doesn't mean I'm not capable of learning, but I do sometimes need information presented to me in a different way for me to get it. And that's really all special ed is. It's meeting a student where they are and developing accommodations, programs, and curriculums to deliver that information to them in the way that they learn, because everybody learns differently. And some of our children require materials and the education they receive at school delivered in a different way. And that's what's really the definition of special ed is. Our kids are smart and they're very capable of learning, but unless the information is delivered in a way that they can ascertain it, they maybe won't do as well as another student sitting next to them. So that's really what special education is. And to be eligible for special education, you need to demonstrate that there is that need. Next slide. So again, what is special education? Well, there actually is a definition, and Renee talked a little bit about, free and appropriate education based on an individual needs, right? Well, that comes from federal education law, and it is underneath the Individual with Disabilities Act, and it's called IDEA. And it is the law that says that every child is entitled to a free and appropriate education, right? And in order to qualify for special ed services in this educational world, you have to show that your child has a deficit. And by special ed services, you're not giving them an advantage, but you're actually leveling out the playing field. So what special ed services do, they enable a child that may learn differently through a different class setting, through an accommodation, through what we call related services, and I'll get into that in a minute. It helps level the playing field so they can learn just like everybody else. But the most important thing about special ed services is they have to be individual, because like I just said, we all learn differently. So it can't be the same program for every single child. It must be individual, and it must meet the needs, the unique needs of how that person learns. And when you do that, you'll hear me talk about this again a little bit later, we develop what's called an individualized education plan, which is called an IEP, which is literally a specialized program designed for that student to meet their unique learning style. Another important part of what special education is, and this goes for everybody, because every student's entitled to a free and appropriate education, right? That's what FAPE stands for. Well, special ed services ensure that those children that are neurodiverse learners or a child with a disability of any kind, including emotional disturbance, will receive a free and appropriate education augmented by special education services. And who is really eligible? Well, really we start at the age of 3. Before 3, they're going through, and every county calls it differently. Here on Long Island, we call it early intervention. That's for our younger kids, right? But when they're 3 and up, their educational services come through a school district. You still may be getting your services at home, but it actually comes through your school. So you can have an IEP as early as 3 years old. And your IEP will last all the way up until your child graduates from their high school experience. Some graduate at the age of 18. Some are entitled, particularly if you have a classification of special ed, to continue their education post their high school age equivalent of 18 up to 22 years of age. I want to talk a little bit because you might have heard 504 versus IEPs, right? So within the special education caveat of services, some students are granted an IEP, some are granted a 504, and everybody's like, well, which is better? Well, it's not that one is better, which is more appropriate for the child, right? So for a 504 plan, for example, that's primarily granted to students that have a disability that impairs their functionality in the classroom, but it may not be related to education. So what I mean by that is maybe there is a student that may have limited use of their arm, right? They can learn, they can do math, they can do science, they can read, but they can't write the way another student would because they have a limited use of their arm. So there may be accommodations, preferential seating, and technology applied to that student that will enable them to, again, level the playing field so they can be successful. It may be a student that has ADHD, right? Because ADHD sometimes affects our students with their organizational skills, their focus, their attention. And sometimes by giving that student extra time in a class, giving them a preferential seat, providing maybe a separate location that's a little bit quiet so that they can actually focus on testing. Those are accommodations that will allow them to be successful. But that student is usually a student with ADHD that doesn't have a learning issue attached, right? That's just strictly focus, attention, and executive functioning. So it really, that's a little bit different. When you go over to the IEP side, it's a little different, right? Because an IEP student has to demonstrate that their disability affects their ability to learn, right? So they're having trouble ascertaining the education part of their school day because there is a learning deficit, and they need to qualify by falling into one of, I believe it's 12 different categories. I don't have all the categories in front of me, but for example, it could be language impaired, speech and language. It could be autism is one of the categories. It could be, we have a category called other health impaired, which kind of encapsulates a lot of different challenges. It could be emotionally dysregulation, or we call emotionally disturbed, which is a student that has mental health challenges that make it very difficult for them to be successful in the classroom. It could be auditory, it could be visual, it could be motor. And these are all disabilities that fall underneath the criteria that the US federal government has said it would qualify for a federal education / special ed placement, right? So their disability is a learning related challenge and requires more specific, more intensive intervention. So a 504 is primarily going to be accommodating and modifying the environment that the student's in, because they can still learn, but they need things kind of tweaked a little bit so that they can be successful. With a child with an IEP and a specific learning challenge or disability, one of those 13 categories, you're going to also get accommodations and modifications, but you might also require a special classroom. You might need related services. You might require a resource room for reteaching. So that's the difference between a 504 and an IEP in regards to what those particular plans would include. When we get to the age, for a 504 plan, there's no age limit. With an IEP, it really is school driven. So it's that 3 to 21 years of age. But I do want to point out that, and this has been brought up a lot, people are like, oh, I got to get a 504 before I graduate because I need to take it to college. No, when you graduate with an IEP, you'll get an exit credential, which will have all the same information that a 504 would have on it, the things that make sense for you, the accommodations that would work for you in a college setting. So I don't want people to think that one is better than the other. It really goes back to what best serves the need of the child, right? In regards to, that's the next line with the paperwork, both can be used for college. So I want to make sure I say that even though an IEP ends in high school, you will get an exit credential when you leave high school that will have the same thing that a 504 would have on it. How this child learns best, accommodations that work best with this child, and actually a summary of all the things that have been done over the years in the public school or private school system, regardless of where the student may be. The big difference that I see with the 504 and an IEP is the legalities and how it's mandated within the school district. A 504 plan is a plan, just like it says, that is agreed upon within the powers of the school district. So this isn't a federal document that you can, say there's a law that goes to this. This is based on how your school feels that they can accommodate that child, right? So it's based on school policy. An IEP is a federally mandated document, right? So there is a protocol, there is a mandatory reporting, there needs to be goals attached to it, there needs to be a reporting structure, and there needs to be growth and movement. So you will have, you're going to have meetings with the 504 once a year to update your 504, but with an IEP, you're going to have IEP goals, and you're going to have reports that will come home to you quarterly on how your student is doing based off of the goals that you agree upon within your CSE committee. So it's a little different. There's a little bit more meat in an IEP in regards to how it's followed through, and the fiduciary responsibility on the school. Quite frankly, there's a lot more responsibility on the school to deliver on the IEP in regards to goals and reporting structure. And last but not least, the recourse that you have when things are not followed. And let's hope we don't get there. But with the 504 plan, because it's not a federally mandated document, you have less recourse, but you do have recourse. You can still ask for meetings with the school. You can still hire a lawyer too if you want. You can go to arbitration. With an IEP though, there are safeguards and procedural guidelines that are built into your IEP that you have, including when a child is suspended. when a child is suspended based off of an activity that may happen, there's a safeguard procedure if they have an IEP, that if the child's suspension is a direct result of their disability, then the suspension can be, I wouldn't say revoked, but suspension is looked upon and a mandatory IEP meeting is had so that they can relook at the plan to put things in place so that the activity that the student did that got them suspended in the first place doesn't happen again, and it is addressed in a different manner. So there's a little bit more more recourse with an IEP than there is in a 504, but I don't want anybody here today that has a 504, maybe thinking about a 504, that there isn't a way to have recourse. There is, it's just a little less. Next slide. I'm sorry, Renee. Okay, so then how do you get this? How do you qualify for this? Well, like anything else, the eligibility is that your disability, again, this is the 504, has to affect your function in the classroom, right? Usually it starts out with a written request to your either principal or your special educator, and every school's different. Some schools, the building, meaning the building where the child is, really sets the 504 because it is driven by building accommodations and modifications that that building can deliver, right? So sometimes you'll have a building principal and teachers involved in that 504 meeting, but the IEP is very different. The IEP requires a special education committee. It is much more formal. It is also starts with a written request for an evaluation, and I'll get into that on the next couple of slides in a little bit more detail. But with an IEP, like I said before, you're given an IEP based off an educational skill deficit or disability, right? So the deficit might be dyslexia, like language processing, auditory processing, a visual impairment, an auditory issue. So it could be even a physical, you sometimes have gross motor challenges that qualify under the IEP. And all of these things start with a written request. I think my child might need help. Could I have a meeting on this? Could he be tested? And that's how it all starts. Next slide. So one of the really important things that we talked about in being successful, and Renee really kind of captured a lot of this in some of the slides, but I want to drill down a little bit deeper here, is, doing your research and requesting assessments prior to your meetings, right? Now, if you've never had an assessment, you really can't do that. So doing your research and understanding what your child needs to be successful. For example, if you realize that your child is having a hard time articulating or actually reading, pronouncing words or reading, it might be a speech issue. Document that, research a little bit about what a typical child at that age may be doing, explain how those challenges are, and ask for a meeting, right? And if you're having a meeting with special ed and you have evaluations, make sure that you too bring personal interjections in there, because one of the challenges I had is both my children happened to have significant learning differences, but they were really good at test taking, which was kind of odd. So they would score really high. And the other problem is, they would look like they're doing great, but I was able to here's the problem. My son can't tie his shoes. He can't button his coat. He can't use a pair of scissors. Yes, he might be able to do this, but the adaptive skill score versus the actual score on the piece of paper will kind of level it down or actually change it so that they can actually see that there is a problem here that needs to be addressed through the special education committee. And again, when I say support, support your claims for services with data, I cannot emphasize this enough. Every parent will see something in their child. Johnny got this. I think I'm going to go to the special ed director and ask for the same thing. I heard Susie across the street's getting 3 hours of reading a week. That would be really good for my kid because my kid struggles. I think I'm going to go. You got to go in with real data. My child is not able to do their homework because they can't decipher the questions on the page for the math. My child is not able to complete homework because they're so frustrated that they're having anger issues. They don't, or even worse, my child is frustrated that they will not go to school and they're having school avoidance. So you got to put your data together to support your claims sometimes for the services that you're asking for, but more importantly, so that you can show a pattern of distress, a pattern of dysfunction, so that the educators and the people that are looking at other data, like I said, I had good test takers. They came out really high on their scores. It took me 3 years to get the district to diagnose my daughter and give her accommodations for reading. And my daughter turns out to be, my daughter's dyslexic, but she didn't look dyslexic because she was able to score pretty high on some of those tests until she got to middle and high school, and then she fell on her face. But if we knew earlier, right, if we were able to show all the other things that totally demonstrated that she was dyslexic, I didn't know at the time that her anger, her frustration could be tied to a learning disability. I just thought she didn't like to do homework. I didn't know as a parent, and I wasn't taking data. But when you take a look at your child and you took a look at the whole child, look at all of those things, because they're really, really important. And the earlier that you get special education services, the more important it is, because you're able to head things off before they get to the ages where they stop the fun stuff. And I shouldn't say that education is fun. The earlier years are fun, but once they get to middle and high school, educational deficit will definitely affect their self-esteem and their mental health. So you want to get them services before they get to middle and high school. Get your children special ed services as early as possible. And I want to say something here. A lot of times parents are afraid to actually even ask for special ed services because they don't want their child, quote unquote, labeled. I just want to say this. Both my children graduated from their high schools. My son actually was placed in a BOCES out of district program. So he didn't even graduate from the actual high school in the community where we live. But they both have diplomas that say the name of the high school, and nowhere on it does it say that they were in special ed. Nowhere on their high school diploma. So I don't want people to feel that when you're asking for these services, they're being labeled or someone's going to look at them differently. It's just giving them the help that they need. Again, going back to what makes you qualify for special ed, they're getting the support they need so that the playing field is level for them. They are at the same place as the student next to them that doesn't have the deficit that they do. And that's really, really important. The next thing about getting everything in writing that you see on the screen, I could not say is any more important than any other thing that we discussed today. Whenever you have any conversation with anybody in the school district, you need to write it down and document it. You also need to, when you speak to people in your school district after you spoke to a teacher, send them a little email. It was so nice to speak to you. Just wanted to recap our conversation here. You talked about the challenges so-and-so was having in class, and you mentioned that you would do this to change that in class. So you want to jot those things down. And I'm not here to say that school districts don't follow through, but sometimes they're human too. Maybe they don't. Maybe they forget, or they do some of the things you discussed, but they didn't do others. So you want to have that paper trail, and you want to document all of your conversations so that if something is falling through the cracks, you can say, remember when we met on October 5th? Oh, I have a piece of paper here. I remember jotting down some things. We said we were going to do this. And as Renee said, how is that going? How is he doing in the classroom? How is that extra time you're giving him on the test making a difference in the scores he's doing? Just jot everything down. The other reason you want to jot things down is, for example, when you're having conversations and you're asking for reports, there are legalities with how long a school district has to respond to you. If you call the school and ask for help, and you've asked for, let's just say, an assessment for special ed, and they don't call you back for a month, no, that's not right. There's a law that says the school district needs to respond to you within 21 days, right? So what you want to do is you can make a call and ask for an evaluation and speak to a teacher or a special ed director, but you want to follow up with an email. Thank you for your conversation. Just wanted to recap. I would like to formally request a special ed review, and you had the date on it. So when they don't call you back, you can get, I called you I called you over a month ago and I requested this in writing. Can you tell me what the status is? And, these are important things to have. And again, I don't like to be negative, but down the road, if there continues to be a problem and you do need to go to arbitration, or you do need to have another CSE meeting, or you do need to hire a lawyer, these are all the things that your lawyer or your advocate's going to ask you to pull together is proof, the data. When did you request this? Did you make this problem aware to the school district? And, if you don't have anything in writing, it becomes subjective, right? I don't remember you asking that, Mrs. Smith. I don't remember us having this conversation. But if you have it in writing, they can't debate it. So it's really important to back everything up, all of your requests in writing, every decision, every conversation. And it really doesn't take a lot, bullet point it, just something to put on a piece of paper. And Renee and I talked a little bit before this meeting. I have binders that I have put together for my children every year. And I put together an educational binder when I start the beginning of the school year. I put a beautiful picture of their face on the front of it, right? And I carry that binder every time I go into school. And I always turn it so they can see my child's face. So they remember when they're talking about the data that they usually have on a piece of paper, that there's a human being attached to that data. And it's a beautiful, wonderful, lovely person, right? I also have categories in my binder. So notes, obviously, testing, obviously, but also historical data too, because even though I may be talking to his second grade teacher, what happened in kindergarten might be relevant to the conversation I'm having with the teacher in second grade, because there might be a historical data that's important for them to understand, or a history of deficit that I want them to understand. So keep binders together for your children. Start one at the beginning of every school year. Have tabs for IEP, test results. What's really nice is when you bring examples of their work to a meeting. I love a teacher that will say, like, "Oh, Johnny's writing is beautiful," and I'll pull out something that they brought home. "You mean this right? This here? This is something he did last week. Can you read what that says?" Because a lot of times, the proof is in the pudding, right? You have proof of their work, and you can bring that back into a meeting to show that maybe they're not really doing as well as maybe somebody may be saying that they're doing. And I'm not saying that teachers are disingenuous, but a lot of times we have to make the case for the support, or actually help them along with their jobs as well. The next thing about asking questions as you prepare for your meeting, what I do, because I'm human and I forget a lot of things, is I always make a cheat sheet before I go anywhere. And it's all the things that I want to make sure I want to ask the teacher so I don't forget. Right. So I bring that with me at all times, and we're all human. And sometimes we get fixated on one thing and we forget the thing on line 2 or 3 is really important and we really needed to bring that up, but we spent half an hour on the bullet number 1 or bullet number 2. Make sure that you prioritize the things that are important to your child, put them in a notebook, carry them with you, and make sure that you ask those questions. And if you can, before any major meeting, let's say that you are your child's in special ed and you're going into an IEP meeting, I always like to speak to the teachers prior, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I don't want a surprise when I walk into that CSE meeting, because as Renee said, it could be really intimidating, and you may have 12, 13, 14 people in that room, and something happens when you just sit down, and no matter how well prepared you are, something leaves your brain, right? And it's emotional because they're talking about your kid, and they're not, especially when you have a child that has a special ed challenge, they're talking about your child and they're focusing on a lot of things that they're not doing well. So we're all human, sometimes I just want to swallow water, but take a couple seconds to breathe in what they're saying, right? Because sometimes it's not really good news, and we're all human. So be prepared, write stuff down, go in with what you need. Don't walk into a meeting and let them dictate that meeting, right? You need to have as much say in that meeting, and you need to make sure that your points are heard in that meeting. And Renee talked about this, and I cannot state this enough. Be a team player. I happen to be like a positive mindset person on even on a bad day. I'm just always trying to find the silver lining in everything that goes on in life. And even though I may be frustrated with the school administrator or a teacher, or the fact that my child's IEP isn't being implemented in a timely manner, I go in with hope. I go in with hope, I go in with confidence, and I go in with a mindset that we are going to have a successful meeting. And the only way you can do that is by working collaboratively with somebody and not blaming, shaming, accusing, because it only sets a tone for the people on the other side of the room to become defensive and not hear all the things that you have to say, because they're not now respecting you anymore. They're looking at you as an adversary, right? You're a team player, you're a team member. So when you go into any of these meetings with the school district, you're all on the same team. And I do believe the schools want the best for our children, but sometimes they just don't know what that strategy or best thing is. And we do, because they're our kids, right? We have more experience. So go in there, work collaboratively, keep an open mindset. Don't go in with an accusatory manner. And even when you know they're wrong, and I've had this happen to me a lot, and I'll give you that example with the paper trail, because this helped me. I was receiving services for my son, and the instructor, it was what we call parent training, right? The instructor just quit. And I called the school and I'm like, can you get me another one? The instructor quit. Okay, we'll work on it, Mrs. Deiches. It was now a month and a half and I wasn't receiving my services. And I called for a big meeting and they're like, well, we didn't know. And I'm like, what do you mean you didn't know? I called you and, oh, wait, I emailed you on December 2nd. Would you like to see the copy of the email? And they're like, oh, I must have lost that email. I said, really? Because, you responded to it. I had the response on April 10th. Would you like to see that? And, that's what I'm saying. But I didn't accuse them. I wasn't nasty. I was just factual. And that's a really hard thing to do as a parent, because as a parent, it's an emotional thing. It's your kid, but you got to go in thinking positively. So I didn't go in there like, you forgot, you didn't do this. I was like, oh, it's okay. Here's a letter that I sent. Maybe this will help remind you. I didn't do it in a mean way. I did it in a nice way. I did it in a factual way. And what came out of that meeting was I was entitled to what they call compensatory services, because he had an IEP, and by law he has to get those services even if the person quit. They got to go back and give me somebody else, and they did. And this happened towards the end of the year, so we actually, he got the services over the summer, because we couldn't even squish them in, but he still got the services that he needed. And I think if I went in there with the, like, you guys screwed up, the person, I might not have gotten what I needed, even though I was legally entitled to it. Because a lot of times, if you don't know what you're legally entitled to, trust me, the school may or may not share that information, right? So, you want to be a team player. You want to be someone that they want to help, right? We all have people that we work with that sometimes annoy us. And do we want to help them? No. But the people that are nice to us, the people that validate us, the people that listen to us and give us respect, all humans, we're all connecting, we're all connected, and we like to connect with other people. And so they're going to want to help you, because they're like, we like this family, we love this child, we want to make sure they're successful, we're going to help them. But not if you go in there with a bad attitude, right? And I covered this before about bringing your concerns and your priorities for services in with you on a piece of paper. And I usually start every CSE meeting, and like I said, I write it down, because I do forget. Because as many years as I've been doing this, and even for the clients that I represent as a family support specialist, before every CSE meeting, I have a little dotted piece of paper for me that reminds me, these are the 5 points we have to get across in this meeting. The outcome for the client is this. And if we don't get to this outcome, like Renee said, what do we do to negotiate to get to a closer point to make that happen? Right? Or we say, fine, we're gonna table that today, but we're coming back in 2 weeks and we're gonna have this conversation again. Or fine, we'll give it a month and we'll see how it goes with the new strategy you have in place. But I'd like to set a meeting for October, just in case things don't go well, so we can work together to come up with another strategy, right? So always thinking positive, always being proactive, always setting your priorities for success. Next slide. one of the things I think that sometimes parents don't realize, and that's that whole comment that I just said, is sometimes parents don't know what they're really entitled to, is that you can request a meeting anytime you want. You can request an IEP meeting. You can request a 504 meeting. You don't have to wait for what we call regularly scheduled, usually with an IEP meeting, you meet twice a year or once a year for an annual review if things aren't really tweaked. You can meet at any time. And I like to do that proactively. Sometimes in an IEP meeting, I said, you know what? Since this is such a complicated case and we've made such progress with all the wonderful interventions you put together, I think we should make sure that we don't miss talking together like we did today, because this was just so valuable. Can we put in the IEP that we're going to have quarterly meetings in October, November, March, and April, and we'll put it right in the IEP. Right? Because everybody gets busy. But if it's in the IEP and we're writing it down and we're keeping a record of what we agreed, right? Because we're going to have a record of what we agreed, we're going to meet on a more regular basis, so we won't have issues, right? I'm not even saying you should ask to record. You should always record a meeting, specifically your IEP meetings. I record every meeting, but you need to put that in writing and you need to let them know. So when you get a request for an IEP meeting, even a 504 meeting, you can say, do you mind if I record this meeting? I request to record this meeting. And so the reason you want to let your school district know this in advance is because legally, if you are recording a meeting, your school district has to record a meeting. So it is a law. Like if you record, they have to record. Same thing as if you're going to bring a lawyer, which I don't recommend, but if you just, some people get like, I'm bringing a lawyer to my meeting. You have to let your school district know that you're bringing a lawyer. Again, it's a law. You can't walk into a room with a lawyer if they don't have their lawyer there too. And if they don't know about it, sadly, they will tell you, I'm sorry, we can't have this meeting today. And you have a lawyer that you just paid X amount of dollars for, hours for his time, right? No. Put everything in writing. Again, can't wait to have the meeting. So looking forward to, seeing you all again. I plan on recording the meeting, wanting to let you know in advance. And by the way, I'm bringing XYZ. I'm bringing my neighbor. I'm bringing my parent advocate. I'm bringing my attorney. You need to let the school know these things in advance in order for you to have a successful meeting and make sure that it happens. And that goes, you can bring anybody to a meeting. And like I said before, I happen to be one of those people that when somebody gets really down and drills into issues with my child, I get emotional because it's my child, it's my heart. So I always bring backup, whether it's a friend, an educational advocate, a family support worker. For those of you that are agape families, you're blessed that you have a family support specialist. Make sure you call them up and have them come. We are all trained and we all do multiple CSE meetings, so we would add value in any capacity. Just like you wouldn't go to a doctor alone that maybe is a specialist that may be giving you some very important information. You always want to bring a husband, a friend, or something, because sometimes when you're hearing stuff, you miss important details. You bring somebody else with you, they may hear something that you didn't. And I can tell you, even myself, there are things sometimes that I miss that my husband said, you remember when they said that? I'm like, they said that? When did they say that? And thank God I'm recording, because I will go back to the recorder and say, oh, they did say that. I didn't hear that. Always good to bring back up. The paperwork that is required and produced by that's the special ed, again, is overwhelming. So bring your binder. And like I said, I like to personalize mine. Maybe it's the crafty part of me, but I have pictures of my son all over the front, and I push it up so that his picture is standing up the entire time we are in this CSC meeting. Now, that's when he was little. When my son was in middle school through high school, and my daughter too, because like I said, I have two children that are diagnosed with different learning challenges, and my son had mental health challenges. I always made sure my child was there. And you know your child best. If you feel that maybe your child wouldn't be able to hear the information, I'm going to give you a counterpoint right now or play devil's advocate with you. There should be nothing about your child without your child there. There's a whole movement. It's called Nothing About Me Without Me. Now, you can make sure that your child is invited to the meeting, maybe the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the meeting, so that they hear some of the things that have been resolved as opposed to some of the things that may be triggering for them in that meeting. But when the child reaches middle school age and on, if they are able to have the cognitive ability to understand what's going on, they should be in their IEP meetings. And I will give you a couple of examples of this. Is a lot of times people make decisions for our children about what they think will work and not work, and the child's not bought into the process. I can't tell you how many kids go to CSE meetings and afterwards are like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. It's important that the committee hear it, because the committee, unlike mom or dad who'll be like, well, why aren't you doing it? You have to do it. The special ed committee will listen and say, okay, can you give us a reason why? Can you tell us why you don't want to do that? Why don't you want to be in the resource room? What's the obstacle for you going to the resource room? And they'll problem solve right there with the child, and often learn very valuable information that will only create a stronger and more meaningful IEP because the child's got buy-in on it, right? It's really important. And if you have a child that maybe has a disability that makes it difficult for them to communicate their thoughts, listen, it's hard for adults to talk about the situations in an IEP, let alone a child. One of the tips that I've always done with both of my children is I had them write letters. It was Dear Special Ed Committee, I want you to let you know. And this one, my daughter, I wish my daughter was here to actually read this, because she would read this every year, because we had to do this several years because it wasn't resolved. Finally, it got resolved. She's like, I'm tired of my teachers telling me to try harder and that I'm smart. I am trying hard. I don't know how to try harder. Please help me. Show me what trying harder means. And she would write that in a letter. And I actually had a teacher start to cry. She's like, I had no idea she was that troubled. And it was a teacher that she happened to not do well with, and that teacher that the two of them were kind of button heads. My daughter was like, I hate that teacher. And the teacher said, she's not trying, she's bright, she's not trying, she's lazy. I'm like, no, she doesn't. She doesn't know what you need. She doesn't know how to do what you want her to do. And they sat down in that IEP meeting, and they forgot that all the rest of us were there, and the two of them had a conversation, and it was the best conversation I think they probably had ever in the entire year. But they worked out what each one of them needed from each other. And by the end of the year, my daughter's like, I love her. She's my favorite teacher. And I'm like, that's the one you hated at the beginning of the year. But again, just like what we do as parents with our children, how important it is to have clear communications, to have people be validated, that my daughter's feelings were validated and the educator's feelings were validated. Both of them realized they both wanted the same thing, but they just were missing that connection. But that's why it's important to bring kids to the meeting. I had another student just last week, actually, that came to their IEP meeting and asked for an exemption from Spanish. And he is challenged with language, but he didn't qualify with, there's a lot of data and testing. But he made a really convincing case by stating, I have a very difficult time, deciphering information when I read. I'm not going to college. He made it very clear that he was a vocationally tracked student. He doesn't need the Spanish credits or even a Regents diploma, because he wanted to go directly into a vocation. And sure enough, it was determined at that time that we would make that student Spanish exempt, but we would give them a multi-language class instead. So it wasn't a hardcore language curriculum, but it was 1 year of a multi-language class, which would qualify for his language requirements based on an IEP educational deficit, because they were diagnosed with a reading disability, and they were able to move on and be happy and not worry about failing class, or in this kid's case, he was cutting class because he just couldn't take the language class. It was painful, literally like painful. And I think we forget, I want us all to think back when we do something that's really, really hard as adults. What do we do when it's really, really hard? We stop, right? Kids do the same thing in school. And we need to help them not stop, because school shouldn't be a place that makes them stop. We should foster their love of learning, because we should be giving them the information in a way that works for them. So that's why you want to organize your paperwork. You want to, when you go to IEP meetings, you want to bring back up, you want to record your meetings, and you want to make sure that you do them on a more frequent basis. Now, here's the reality of sometimes what happens. What happens when when these things aren't happening, when you've done all the right things and you're not getting the help you need? Like, what do you do? Well, there's a lot of things you can do. First of all, don't let it fester to the point that your child is failing and no longer going to school and you're having screaming matches in your home. First thing you're going to do is you're going to call and you're asking for a team meeting to discuss your concerns. And again, as we just said, you can do this at any time. You can do this weekly if you had to. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do it weekly if you had to. You're entitled to ask for a meeting at any time you want. If that doesn't work, right? Then, you've asked for a team meeting with the team, you've talked to the teachers, the guidance counselor's on board, the school psychologist is there, but you're still not getting what you need. Your child has an IEP. Well, then you ask for a CFC meeting for what we call a review of placement or a review of services. Everybody calls it different. I was just at a review of services today, and what we did is we just added a couple new services, right? So that could be speech, it could be OT, it could be a new accommodation, or a revised goal in the IEP that addresses the skill deficit that the student's going through, right? There's a lot that can be done. And as Renee said, you don't have to wait till the end of the year. You can do this at any time during the year. You can augment an IEP, change a goal, or add a goal if it needs to address a concern. Now, I talked about this a little bit before, but asking for compensatory services in an IEP is really important, and it doesn't happen when somebody quits. For example, this happens a lot with our kids in regards to speech, occupational therapy. It might be a reading support, or even in AIS classes, as Renee was talking before, the intervention classes. Sometimes kids, will come home and say, "Mommy, my speech teacher, I didn't have speech today, or I didn't have speech last week," or whatever. Pay attention, jot that stuff down. They're entitled to make up sessions for any time a teacher was sick, a class was canceled, holidays, right? Snow days. If it was a snow day, right, and your school was closed, but they're still entitled to, every 4 days a speech class, or whatever the cycle of their service is, they're still entitled to that. And so that's where compensatory services can come into play. The next step, if none of those things are helping, and you've had meetings and you've got plans and they're not working, well, then the next thing is to file a state complaint. And I believe I have the number on the slide, but I do have the address on the slide where you can go for that. But listen, New York State's very happy to pick up the phone and listen to your complaints. Filing a state complaint is the best thing you could do, because it's really simple. You call the state, and there's regions of the state. So there'll be upstate, downstate, Long Island. You'll have all different numbers, and you'll say, "My student is a student at XYZ middle school. He hasn't been getting speech classes. I've called the school. They haven't made up the time. What do I do?" And when you file a state complaint, the state then goes back to your school, but in a different way. They're like, "This is a problem that this parent has had. Fix it, XYZ school, fix it." And the school has to fix it and then get back to the state on how they fixed it. So finally, your problem is going to be solved because you filed a state complaint. So I always say, don't be afraid to file a state complaint. I've filed many in my time. The next step is asking for special education mediation, which is a gentler, kinder way of asking for an impartial hearing. A special education mediation, and this is what New York State wants us to do, as opposed to get lawyers and all that. They want to have a mediation. So mediation is similar to any kind of mediation. The school district will supply you with a list of mediators. You pick one, right? And the school district will meet with you. they'll have their personnel, you'll come in, you'll both talk about the complaint, and the special education mediator will come out with a stipulation or a verdict from that. So it's not a trial, but it is mediation, right? And in mediation, the nice thing about mediation is that's where you have a little wiggle room with, you do this, I'll do this. Okay, maybe I'll do that. You have a little bit of legal room, but whatever comes out, the decision comes out is a standing decision, and the school's required to follow through. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you don't, but it's like anything else, depending upon the data. That's why have the data, have the backup, have your binder with you, have all your information ready, because most of us, we don't have the time to like call the school and demand things that we're not entitled to, right? I don't know about you, but I'm a pretty busy person, right? But if my child's not getting the education that they are legally entitled to, yes, I will make the time, and I will make the time to set up these meetings. The last step, and Renee talked about this before, and I can tell you from personal experience, because I did an impartial hearing with my school district. I spent thousands of dollars, and yes, we did win, but knowing better now, if I probably would have done some of those steps earlier on, I wouldn't have gotten there. At that, you do the best you can with what you got at the time. I wasn't as better educated back then as I am now. But if you have an IEP, even if you have a 504, you can file for what's called an impartial hearing. And this is what people consider like when you sue a school district, right? And I say I rarely recommend this, because yes, you may win. Like I did. I won. I have a stipulation for 4 years. The district was required to was actually required to pay for private education for my son, actually. And for my daughter, I went to a special education mediation, and they were required to give her a customized 1-hour reading class daily for her dyslexia. So that was great. But the other problem that I had was whenever you go through whether it be mediation or an impartial hearing, there is a lapse of time, right? When you work with attorneys, they don't work quickly. It's kind of the way they bill, right? They make money off of sending letters and scheduling meetings, and it also adds up pretty quickly, the price tag for all of that. And while you may come out with a judgment that's beneficial, was it worth the couple of months that your child did not get what they needed when you could have went back to some of those other conversations, having CSC, opening up the communications, doing things earlier on. Now, some things you really do need to sue for. If your child truly is not getting FAPE in regards to they're not properly placed, and they're failing to thrive in the environment that they are, you may have to. But I'm here to say that there's a lot of ways to avoid going to an impartial hearing. And in my case, like I said, from start to the time that we filed our petition to the time that the case was heard was 7 months. We almost lost the entire school year. And yes, we won, but my child was on home instruction for 7 months, because that's the other thing. When you do that, mine was for I was fighting for an out-of-district custom placement. Because it's not resolved, the child can't go back to the placement they're in because you're saying it's not appropriate, right? So there's pros and cons to everything. So I highly recommend that if you have the opportunity to work with an educational advocate, and there's a lot of them out there, your family support specialist, you consult with them first, because in most, and I mean almost all cases, there are things that you can do before you get to that impartial hearing stage. And like I said, sometimes there are things that, that you do, you really do have to sue for, but in most cases, you can solve that on your own. So what are other resources, and what are the other people? I call it my circle of support, right? Who is my circle of support as Mama Bear, right? Like, who do I go to for information? Well, one of the best places to go is, and I may be a little impartial here because I've been a SEPTA president for 7 years, but to go to your local school district special education PTA. I think PTAs are great. I'm a big PTA mom. But your SEPTA, which is your special education PTA, these are special ed moms that walk in the same shoes as you do if you have a child with an IEP, right? They may not have the same diagnosis, but they also know things about the school. They've maybe gone through similar challenges. They may know outside providers or outside consultants that may be able to assist. I love special ed SEPTAs, and also special ed SEPTAs provide a lot of training just in their regular meetings. A lot of SEPTAs, like a local PTA, will meet once a month, but they'll bring in a guest speaker. They may bring in a neuropsych to talk about the importance of updating a neuropsych on your child, or they might bring a behaviorist talking about different behavior strategies, or they'll bring in maybe a recreational therapist that may talk about different recreational therapies that might strengthen the child's skill deficit. So I love working with SEPTAs. Of course, New York State PTA is also New York State PTA. Wonderful. And on the next slide, when I get there, I have the email addresses for a lot of these resources for you. But New York State PTA has a whole advocacy section of their website because, again, we're all one community, and it's all one voice, and the voice is for the child, right? So they have suggestions on how to work with your school. They have suggestions on how to write letters. They also have a whole special ed section for those of you that have a child that may already be in the special ed system. So New York State PTA is wonderful. Long Island Advocacy Center, for those of you that are on Long Island, is an advocacy center that provides low cost legal and special education advocacy. So, if you're at that point, like I said, before you get to suing your school district, you may want to speak to an educational advocate who does this every day. So they know the laws. They also know what school districts are capable of, because they go to like 50, 60 CSEs a week, right? So they know the systems, they know what to ask for. And your district, when they see you come in with an advocate, will know, okay, mom's armoring up here. We got to be on our best behavior, because mom knows what's going on. I love New York State Parent to Parent. It's a wonderful organization. They provide parent advocates. So let's just say you have a child with autism and you want to speak to another mom with autism. They can hook you up with another arm. They have what they call peer parent supports. So you call them up and say, I really would like to speak to, I have a child that's deaf, and we're having a hard time with the auditory system. And is there anybody you can put me in touch with that has another child like mine that I might be able to talk to learn what best practices are? They're great. They have wonderful webinars. They provide a lot of information. Go on their website. They're great. And then obviously we're all different. So depending upon the deficit that your child has, whether it be ADHD, autism, traumatic brain injury, Down syndrome, dyslexia, autism trauma, if they identify on the LBQT spectrum and you're looking for more information about that, because there may be some challenges in the school there, work with your target specific organizations. I belong to several of these groups that are up here now, and I learn something every meeting that I go to. And just like we were talking about sharing and the whole communication, the importance of communication, it's important to communicate with like-minded parents, which is why you're here tonight. All of us, or you may have a affiliation with adoption, whether you're an adoptive parent, foster parent, kinship parent, or thinking about adoption. Adoption trauma is real. And by even working with AFFCNY and our organization here, we provide so many supports, and we have a lot of materials that you can take to your schools to help explain maybe what's going on with your child. So please make sure that you're utilizing the local community resources in your area. Next slide. These are just some of the websites that I talked about. Rights Law is a wonderful website that really encapsulates almost every topic that you would ever need to know about special education law. They have a Q&A section on the site, but they also have a drop-down menu where you can drop in what you're looking for, and there's going to be something there. Like I said, they have templates on how to write a letter. They have templates on how to talk to your school. they have templates on accommodations that you should be asking for specifically by diagnosis, right? Because everybody's different. What works for me may not work for your child, and what works for somebody else. For example, I'm dyslexic, my daughter's dyslexic, and my son is dyslexic. Now, again, my children came home to me through adoption. I always say, this is a cruel joke, we're all dyslexic. We're all different dyslexics. So the accommodations that work for my daughter would never work for me, because my daughter learns by looking at things. I learn by hearing at things. So my daughter doesn't do really well with audiobooks. She can't listen to an audiobook. I can. So I love listening to audiobooks, right? So again, Wright's Law is a great resource that will show you different types of accommodations and things that you should be thinking about specific to the deficit that your child or the challenge your child might be going through. Understood is a very similar website. Understood is also great, geared towards children of all ages. So you can plug in, my child is 13, has reading issues, and is ADHD. My child is 17, is blind, and has this. You put in whatever you're looking for, and it customizes your landing page and provides you articles that are very specific to what you're looking for. I talked about this is the New York State PTA site, the New York State parent website, Long Island Advocacy site. The other really important resource for us is the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, OPWDD services. Again, these are services for students, and students qualify similar to special ed based on need. And again, if you're not sure if your child would qualify, this is something you should speak with your social worker, your adoption specialist. And I always say, if your child is a child that would qualify for OPWDD, getting the paperwork in earlier as opposed to later will be more helpful to a successful outcome. It provides lifelong services. Now, if your child doesn't qualify for OPWDD, but still has some challenges, the Office of Mental Health may be the way to go. I mentioned before when I introduced myself is I work in the field of mental health. Underneath the Office of Mental Health is what we call Single Point of Access Services, SPOA. I work on 5 different SPOA programs. SPOA is free, just like OPWDD is. When you qualify, SPOA, you have to qualify as well. You have to have a mental health diagnosis. But there are services and assistance that these organizations can provide your family to make the outcome of your child more successful in regards to their disability, in regards to, in this case, mental health. With OPWDD, it may be a cognitive or an autism related challenge. New York Connects is another great website. It's in one of these sites where you go in and you say, I want information on where to get a wheelchair. I want information on where to get this, that, and it's a wonderful intuitive program that connects you to resources all over New York. Same thing with Include New York. It's a very similar website. You clock into it, you look at, you pull down the tab on, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for support for that, I'm looking for in-person ADHD support groups, and they give you a list of everything. And then, of course, us, the Adoption and Foster Family Coalition of New York, when you go on our website, the depth and breadth of information that you will find there is staggering. Even I haven't been able to delve through the entire website. And as a support specialist, I will go on it sometimes even before I go to a family, and I will pull things off of it. And I look like a hero. Meanwhile, it's just on our website. So go to our website. It's very easy to look at. We have a section on school advocacy. We have some really good handouts that the professionals at AFFCNY have put together that you can bring to your school. I can't say enough about the site and the support that it gives. And last but not least, these are the Department of Ed websites. So if you want to learn more about the law, and when Renee talked about that first side that talks about a free and appropriate education based on a child's individual needs, it's part 200 and 201 underneath New York State educational law. That's where you're going to find the laws. So if you click on these links, you're going to find law. Some of the other links down here, I love the New York State transition planning. Not everybody's, designed to go to college. Maybe some people want to go on a vocation. Some kids may go into a day hab program, but this particular link, the transition link, gives you the time frame that you should be thinking about and speaking with your school district about when do you actually target and focus your child towards the direction you want to go. My son, for example, we've known all along he was not going to be a college kid. He always wanted to go into the trades. So we started very early at the age of 12, and we got him vocational evals that helped us ascertain what his skills were. Like Renee said, strengths, 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 right? Our kids all have strengths, and their futures can be very bright if we focus on their strengths, right? So these tests will help you do that, and the timeline will get you there quicker. The Office of Civil Rights, that's where you're going to click on and go to help you with information on 504s, but also with Access VR and some other special ed opportunities. These are all New York State .gov websites that I think are important. Listen, there's a lot of information that you're getting here tonight. Take your time, absorb it, and use it as you need.